here's a question for you. Is it true that sensor size is always a much more important factor than pixel pitch, or the size of the on-sensor pixels, known as photosites for that matter, in affecting the level of unsightly grain due to electronic noise? Or is the opposite true, such that pixel pitch is always more important? Or is neither notion true? Actually, technically, neither notion is completely nor always true. Both notions are actually rather oversimplified, and thus, when they are presented that way, it's natural for both notions to be debated against each other. So what's really happening here at the sensor, and who am I to say that I know any better? Well, what's really going on here is hinted at in the title of this video, which is the implication that a higher pixel pitch can help with shooting video, or, if you understand ETTR, it can help with intentionally overexposing a photo in order to bring down the resulting photo's grain level post-capture. But otherwise, for normally exposed, what you see is what you get straight out of the camera photos. Pixel pitch is actually not much help. As for who I am, I'm someone who has taken in a lot of information, perhaps so that you don't have to. But that's not to say that you shouldn't question what I say, or what anyone else says on this topic. It would not be enough, for instance, if I told you a statement that just sounded nicely simple and right, and then just said that it is irrefutable and undeniable without having proof that could be visually demonstrated to you to back that up. You know, I'm sometimes told that I should say things in a simpler way, but some things are just not so simple. But to me, those are some of the more interesting things in life, and we can still break things down at least. I bet that we would all love it if a small, inexpensive digital sensor, which could be placed in a compact camera, could be designed in a way that it contributes much more to the mitigation of grain than the latest and greatest much larger sensor when taking normal exposures of digital photos, defying the notion that larger sensors tend to contribute more to such mitigation than smaller ones, at least of a similar age with thus similar noise-reducing electronics, again, when taking normal exposures. But the notion seems to still be sound, even if there are those who argue against it. Some people argue against the notion outright, and I think that could cause problems, if it has not already. For instance, imagine purchasing a digital camera with a small sensor through following the advice that greater pixel pitch is more important than greater sensor size for mitigating noise/grain, and then being disappointed with your camera after discovering that basically the opposite situation is true, at least for the way that you might use your camera, such as taking, again, normal exposures and printing photos at a size that really does not need the extra resolution of a larger sensor, but that could use the lower grain level from the larger sensor. It's an unpleasant discovery you might have made through reading up on the issue after you already bought the camera, or even through actually testing your camera and comparing it to others. I would argue that we have to be precise in explaining what is going on here and how, besides other factors, both greater sensor size and greater pixel pitch can be used to mitigate grain. Sensor size and pixel pitch might still be considered to be competing notions as to which is the more important factor, but even so, I think it's important to explain that there are truths behind either competing notion and also exceptions to those truths. More precisely, greater pixel pitch may not serve you significantly better than greater sensor size for doing, again I will say it, normal exposures, which is a very practical consideration for probably most people, but greater pixel pitch could serve you for doing the ETTR, or exposed to the right of the histogram, exposure technique for certain kinds of scenes such as low contrast scenes. Or pixel pitch could serve you for shooting more shadow and highlight detail, which you may or may not want to tonally expand towards showing in your photo, possibly at the expense of compressing midtones. Or pixel pitch could serve you for shooting video, as video is processed differently than photos in the camera. All taken together, this seems like a complex reality, but When we gloss over it and rely on more simplified statements that take sides in a sensor size versus pixel pitch debate, misunderstandings can come from either side of the argument. I haven't really introduced myself yet, so if you don't already know, I'm Stacy Muller. There are a lot of things that I like about YouTube-based photo educators Tony Northrup and Ken Wheeler, and there are important things that both have taught me. But in some cases, both have taught information that has conflicted with each other's teachings, and I get the impression that both have been concerned that misinformation by the other is getting out. Since it also seems that both are intent to keep teaching what they teach, this leaves it up to us to determine what is the most accurate versus the most wrong information and from who either is coming from. It makes sense to me that Tony Northrup teaching that larger sensors gather more light and that this therefore results in less noise, without mention of at least some of the benefits of a large pixel pitch, could lead to a misunderstanding of what is truly going on. But I would suggest a greater concern. A much greater misunderstanding is risked by believing both Ken Wheeler's reason for his outright rejection of that teaching of Tony Northrup and by believing Ken's teaching that pixel pitch is a greater factor than sensor size or total light gathered due to sensor size in affecting grain/noise. I do, however, give Ken credit for properly teaching that ETTR, or sensor saturation/optimization, as well as dynamic range, is all tied to pixel pitch and not sensor size. But Ken Wheeler is easily proven to have made a false accusation about Tony Northrup that, if you believed, would make you think Tony is less intelligent or truthful than he is. Allow me to demonstrate. This is Tony Northrup in his video, Their Biggest Mistakes, Canon, Nikon, Sony, Pentax, Panasonic, and Olympus, posted July 26, 2016 on the channel Tony and Chelsea Northrup, and showing an example of how a smaller sensor courts more grain/noise than even a slightly larger one.
Sony, Pentax, Nikon, every other manufacturer who makes sensors of the same size, they have a 1.5x crop factor. So what that means is Sony, Nikon, Pentax, their sensors are actually slightly bigger than the Canon sensors. They're about 8.6% bigger if you actually calculate the square surface area of them. And what that means is that at any given ISO, the Canon sensor is gathering 8.6% less light, and therefore it's going to generally have 8.6% more noise, even if they're exactly the same. The technology is exactly the same. So Canon is handicapping themselves by almost 9%, which is a big deal, 9%. Now, Canon sensors, the noise levels tend to be a little bit worse than the competitors anyway. I've seen that the noise levels tend to be about, comparing cameras of the same year, about 16 to 25% behind like Nikon and Sony. And so what that means is that 8.6% is pretty significant. It can be about half of that difference could be made up if Canon would just make sensors of exactly the same size.
This is Ken Wheeler in his video, No, 100% Incorrect and Untrue Invalid Claims About Canon 1.6 times Crop Factor and Sensor Sizes, posted the day after on July 27, 2016 on the channel Theoria Apophysis, implying that Tony Northrup in the prior video is suggesting that sensor size affects exposure. Tony did not, and as we'll see later, Tony clarified this in a later video. But let's first clearly establish the accusation made by Ken, also known as the Angry Photographer, by showing a relevant part of his video.
Let me give some exact quotes from this video. Some exact quotes. Canon has a 1.6 crop factor on their APS-C. Okay, that's correct. Now, exact quote. Surface area of others' sensors are slightly bigger than Canon. Now, this person uses the exact word surface area. Length and width. Surface area. Which has nothing to do with exposure. Nothing. A larger sensor versus a smaller sensor does not have a different exposure. All things being equal, if you make that sensor larger or smaller, if it's got the same lens and it has the same efficiency, everything remains the same, and all you do is change the size of the sensor. It has nothing to do with exposure. You see this? Same exposure. Big sensor, small sensor. Big sensor, small sensor. Same exposure. This is irrefutable. It is undeniable. 100% undeniable. Come forward if you want to deny that. But please think before you actually post it. Because you're going to be wrong. You're going to be wrong. You're going to be wrong. Surface areas of other sensors are slightly larger than Canon sensors. This is an exact quote. They are about 8.6% bigger if you actually calculate, here's the really magical word, square surface area. So the person is actually talking about the true square surface area. Like say, 50 square millimeters or something like that. Sensors are not picture windows. They don't work that way. There is not one book, not one camera manufacturer, not one lens manufacturer that is going to tell you that exposure has anything to do with the size of the sensor. Why? Because it is not true. It's not only like, well, that's what you think. That's what you believe. That's what, I think differently. No, you are entitled to your own opinions. Like, I like the taste of sardines on my pizza. Okay, great. You're entitled to your own opinions. You're not entitled to your own facts. F-A-C-T-S. Facts. You're not entitled to your own facts. You're not. Another exact quote, which means at any given ISO, the Canon is gathering 8.6% less light and therefore generally has 8.6% more noise. Not true at all. What is known about Canon is that they have a wee bit inferior sensor technology, but it has nothing to do with the size of the sensor or the crop factor, same thing. He actually uses, exact quotes, surface area, and then again, exact quote, square surface area. Square surface area has nothing to do with exposure. Nothing.
This is Tony Northrup again, this time in his video Olympus EM1X Torture Test and Review versus Sony a7R III, A9, Fuji X-T3, Canon 1DX, Nikon D5, posted a few years later on January 23rd, 2019.
This is a 15-second shot with the fastest 14mm equivalent lens that you can put on either of these systems. And they both look pretty good. But when we zoom in, we can see the results are really pretty drastically different. The Olympus looks good. You can see a ton of stars, but look at all the stars you can see from the Sony. This is due to two reasons. One, the Sony has a sensor that has more than 4 times the surface area, and that means it's gathering a lot more total light. While light is the same on a per square millimeter basis, of course, the larger sensor has more square millimeters and thus it's gathering more light, reducing the amount of noise and increasing the detail. The Sony a7R III also has more than twice the megapixels. I'm mentioning this and I'm comparing these two cameras because they are about the same price, so it seems like a relevant comparison.
This is Ken Wheeler again, this time in his video, Not True, Sensor Size Twaddle, posted January 26, 2019, and referring to the prior video.
I got over 10 emails asking me a question about a really large YouTuber at the 7-minute mark, and this person was comparing various cameras to the new Micro Four Thirds Olympus EM1X camera. And at the 7-minute mark, there was a couple astrophotography examples, and of course, the Sony a7R Mark III had more stars, and it had less noise. And let me give you an exact quote from this video, and let me tell you why it is absurdly wrong. And it's not my feeling that it's wrong, it's not my opinion that it's wrong, it's flat out wrong, period. Here's the exact quote, word for word. The Sony a7R III has 4 times the surface area over that of the Olympus, and this means that it gathers a lot more total light. Well, this is not true because exposure is per unit area, not per total area.
Ken, in at least one video, including a more recent one, made it clear that he reserves the notion of more light to conventional photographic exposure, which indeed is light intensity over a unit area. With that in mind, and getting back to the less recent video, Ken seems to have assumed that Tony, through his words total light, implied exposure, when again, as we will see, Tony has made it clear that he did not, and has made it clear that he knows that sensor size does not affect exposure. Nor, as I have seen, did Tony ever mean exposure through his phrases of total light and more light that he has used in many of his videos, or imply that sensor size affects exposure. Therefore, Ken's assumption of what Tony meant is erroneous and is no proof against Tony's statement.
Now, directly after this, the statement was made that while light is the same on a per millimeter basis, this is true.
Right there, in a short statement, Tony made it clear, at least to me, that sensor size did not affect exposure. It would not be the first time he tried to make it clear that sensor size does not affect exposure, as we will see. And if you don't think that I have yet shown that he has made that clear enough, given that Tony's statement here perhaps seems to be short, much like a mere hint, I will show you soon enough that he most certainly does make it clear in full in another of his videos. I even suspect that Tony had Ken Wheeler in mind as one of the people to address to make these things clear at times that he clarified things, even if it seems that Ken, as well as some of his followers, did not listen to Tony. Let's see how Ken deals with Tony's short statement.
This is true. However, there is vignetting and light fall off because all lenses project a circle of light that actually fades towards the corners, but let's not get into the minutia. So, exact quote, "The larger sensor has more square millimeters, and thus it gathers more light, reducing the amount of noise." This is absolutely incorrect. It is nonsense. It is poppycock. It is bullocks. It is a false statement. Now, I don't know about you, but if I had a zillion subscribers, I might want to get my facts correct. Thus increasing the detail. The Sony A7R, this is the quote once again, "The Sony A7R Mark III has twice the megapixels also." Well, this makes no difference because everything, of course, is about pixel pitch and obviously density.
Ken, as I will demonstrate soon enough, puts a lot of stock in pixel pitch. As reference material that I provide in the description text shows, it is true that despite the fact that you can see the difference in noise/grain at the pixel level between two sensors that have different pixel pitches, you may not see any significant amount of difference when the exposure settings between the two cameras are the same and, most importantly and practically, when a photo from each camera is scaled to a single shared print size by which both photos can be compared. If both photos are from cameras with two different sizes of sensors, greater differences will be seen in grain than if the two photos are from two different pixel pitches or pixel densities, at least when given the practical assumption of similar ages between the cameras and therefore similar noise-reducing electronics between them. Again, you are less likely to see a difference given the practical use of similar normal exposures from both cameras than if you used ETTR or recorded video. It's the scaling step I mentioned that some people such as Ken seem to be missing, regarding that smaller sensors require more upscaling to a print size and thus more upscaling of apparent sensor noise as well, and larger sensors less.
There are many variables to actually account for why the Sony A7R Mark III has less noise. And you know what? It has absolutely nothing to do with sensor size, okay? That quote and the cross-comparator image between the new Olympus EM1X and the Sony A7R Mark III on the star photographs that you were showing in your video at the 7-minute mark, your explanation is incorrect. It is false. It is demonstrably wrong. Here's some of the variables that actually account for that. And by the way, let's actually point out the biggest one. Okay, I don't know if you know what photo sites are or pixel pitch is, but here's the major reason why the Sony a7R Mark III has less noise. Because the pixel pitch on that Sony camera is 4.51 microns, right? And the pixel pitch on the Olympus, which by the way is using an older sensor, on the EM1X is 3.34 micrometers. Okay, the Sony is 4.5, larger eyeballs, and 3.34 on the Olympus Micro Four Thirds. That's the major reason why the dynamic range is better on the Sony and there is less noise. Okay, it has nothing to do with sensor size.
Later in the video, Ken states that pixel pitch is the main variable.
You see that Sony a7R Mark III has a 4.5 micrometer pixel pitch, bigger eyeballs, and that Olympus has a 3.34 micrometer pixel pitch, smaller eyeballs. That's not the only variable, but that's the main variable. I'm glad I could fix this confusion for everybody because these are not my opinions or my feelings, but the facts.
Facts that we feel that he or anyone else has provided visual or satisfactory proof for? Finally, let's see what Tony has to say. Again, I see this as Tony possibly addressing Ken Wheeler in his defense. I also see this as Tony possibly doing damage control to false beliefs that Ken may have spread.
As you can see, the three cameras produced very different images with the same lens. All of the images have the same brightness, because sensor size does not affect the brightness or the exposure of your image. However, it changes just about every other property of it. Another question, does crop factor affect exposure? I covered this at the beginning of the video, but I'll say it again. Crop factor does not impact exposure, not in any way. We covered this in our first crop factor video at about 16 seconds in, but people still bring it up because they're trying to debunk crop factor, this very simple conversion. Your meter doesn't need to tell you anything about crop factor because crop factor does not affect exposure. Crop factor is a conversion that is useful for determining the final image you will get out of a camera and lens pairing. Another argument you'll hear is that it's not the crop factor that matters, but the pixel pitch or the pixel density. And this works out only if you are comparing one pixel on one camera to another pixel on another camera. If your idea of photography is looking at individual pixels, then yeah, crop factor doesn't matter to you. But most of photographers are using the entire sensor and not just one individual pixel to make a picture. Another common question, do full frame cameras gather more light than cameras with smaller sensors? The answer is yes. At any given ISO, at any given f-stop, the full frame camera is gathering more light because, of course, with that lens, there is light hitting the outside edges of the sensor. With a smaller sensor, that light is simply being lost. Using a lens designed for APS-C or Micro Four Thirds does not concentrate the light any more intensely. If you're at the same ISO, it's the same light per square unit area falling on the sensor. Thus, given the same exposure settings, bigger sensors would always receive more total light, and that's why when you do these comparisons without using crop factor, you see that bigger sensors are typically producing less noise, again, if they're of the same generation.
Now, I should provide proof about my statements that balance sensor size with pixel pitch. There are many online sources that back up what I've said, such as videos and articles, and indeed in my description text I provide many links to such sources. I am also planning a longer follow-up video on this subject.
Have you ever met somebody in life that was so full of themselves, so absolutely certain, that they refuse to correct themselves? In other words, if I said something that was completely incorrect, not opinion or belief, just palpably incorrect, and 100 people told me, you know you're not right because boom, 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 you know, I know you made a mistake there. And I was just so full of myself that I stuck to it.
Ken, as I will demonstrate soon enough, puts a lot of stock in pixel pitch. As reference material that I provide in the description text shows, It is true that despite the fact that you can see the difference in noise/grain at the pixel level between two sensors that have different pixel pitches, I will have to answer the phone.